Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Jack C. Taylor Conference Center at the U.S. Naval Institute. I'm Ray Spicer, CEO and publisher at the Naval Institute. Welcome to our history conference, the theme of which is Dominance Through Disruption, the Evolving Military Advantage. Now that you're all comfortably seated, I'm going to ask that you please rise and join me in reciting our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks very much. We are thrilled to be with both our in-person and our virtual audience today, and we are deeply grateful to the William M. Wood Foundation for sponsoring this conference since its inception. And we've been doing it for 14 years. Each year, the Naval Institute hosts a conference in partnership with the U.S. Naval Academy, a history conference, exploring an important issue, its place in history, the current situation, and the implications for the future. I'm going to go off script for a second to explain something to the audience here. So if you hear a hissing sound, that's the sound of my staff sucking wind through their teeth. But I want to explain why you're going to see the lack of active duty flag and general officers here for this conference. We did have some lined up for the conference, some panelists, but we're in the middle of a government shutdown, as you well know, and there are certain restrictions that are imposed on active duty flag and general officers. So we learned about the impact to this conference over the weekend, so it was a nice long weekend of scrambling, trying to put some panels back together, and we had some stellar retired flag officers who stepped up on short notice and are going to fill in on these panels. So it's still going to be a great event, but I want to thank, while I have the opportunity, I want to thank in particular my staff that does these events. April Perico, Don Braun, Amy Starkey, and several others who kind of jumped through some hoops this weekend to keep this conference stable and kind of regroup. So I really appreciate their great work over the weekend on this event. We strive to choose a topic that is both timely and interesting every year. This year's topic, disruptive technologies are reshaping the character of war. From AI and robotics to autonomous systems and next-generation weapons, and they are evolving rapidly, as we have seen in the press. Based on the war in Ukraine and recent activities in the Middle East, in particular the Red Sea, I don't know how we could come up with a topic that is either or timely or interesting. Today we will explore how disruptive military innovations have shaped history, what lies ahead, and how our military can maintain the edge in this era of rapid change. The idea for this topic began last winter in collaboration with Provost Firebaugh of the Naval Academy, and we had the pleasure of developing the program with two key members of the Weapons, Robotics, and Control Engineering Department, Brad Bishop, Associate Dean, Janelle Piepmeyer, Chair. And together we were able to bring you this stellar lineup of speakers and topics. So thank you, Provost Firebaugh, for your guidance and for your continued support. And thank you to Janelle and Brad for your hard work. We extend a special welcome to the midshipmen and Naval Academy faculty who are here with us. We thank you all for carving out time from your academic schedules to participate, especially during a government shutdown. We know it will be worth your while. To set the stage for today's discussions on how disruptive technologies are reshaping the character of war, we're honored to begin with a keynote from Dr. Andrew Krepinevich. Dr. Krepinevich is joining us virtually this morning. He is the leading expert on disruptive military innovation, and his exploration of examples of military adaptation and failure throughout history is key to kicking off this conference and setting the stage for discussions that follow. Dr. Krepinevich is a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute and the Center for New American Security and president of Solarium LLC, a defense consulting firm. He is perhaps best known as the author of the book, The Origins of Victory: How Disruptive Military Innovation Determines the Fates of Great Powers, a remarkable work that traces how innovation has repeatedly altered the balance of power throughout history. Over the course of his distinguished career, Dr. Krepanevich has served as a strategic advisor to senior defense leaders, helped shape long-term military planning, and continues to challenge us to think differently about how we adapt, innovate, and maintain the edge. We are honored to have Dr. Krepanevich with us to kick off this conference. I now turn it over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Spicer, and thank you as well for informing me that any hissing sounds are not reflective of my presentation. I think the sponsors of this conference have chosen a terrific topic, as the Admiral has said, a topic of growing importance to those of us in the profession of arms. Disruptive changes in war's character, military revolutions, as military historians describe them, have enabled militaries to realize a quantum leap in their effectiveness within a relatively short period of time, hence the term revolution. Since the Industrial Revolution, they've been enabled by advances in technology and exploited by militaries. These technologies are exploited by militaries through what is called disruptive innovation, innovation on a grand scale, to realize these substantial boosts, these major boosts in military effectiveness. And given my experience of serving in the Pentagon, I'd like to take a few minutes to set the stage. And of course, that means a few slides in my presentation. So if we could bring the first slide up, please. I think looking at today's military, today's American military, we confront three disruptive changes in the competitive environment. One is what we call the maturation of the precision warfare regime. The Soviets, who talked about a potential military technical revolution enabled by reconnaissance strike complexes, the fusing of scouting, strike, and coordination capabilities, the battle network, to conduct operations at a much higher rate of speed over a much wider area with greater lethality. They said the first time they saw this was in the first Gulf War. And we had a monopoly on this kind of warfare for several decades. But that monopoly is ending. And so we have to adapt to the fact that this mature regime means that other militaries, particularly the People's Liberation Army, now has these kinds of capabilities. And so, in a sense, we're talking about a conflict in which we could see dueling reconnaissance strike complexes. And we have to adapt to that because over the last 30 years, we've been not only afforded that monopoly, but we've been engaged in other kinds of operations in what we call permissive environments, where we weren't really contested by those kinds of capabilities. And so that adaptation, that shift on our part to a different competitive environment is one aspect of this era of disruptive change. The second, which I think focuses really a lot on what this conference is about, are the technologies that are likely fueling a new military revolution, exploiting these technologies that are now developing. And of course, we see them in this conference agenda: artificial intelligence, robotics, directed energy, and so on, to once again affect a major or quantum boost in military effectiveness in a relatively short period of time. So in a sense, we're trying to adapt to a mature precision warfare regime that we introduced 30 years ago, which is now mature, but also the potential for an overlapping disruptive shift in the character of war. The third area of disruptive change has to do with the emergence of what I would call a tripolar nuclear regime, with China's decision apparently to match both us and the Russians in terms of the size and quality of our nuclear arsenals. So we're shifting, it seems likely over the next decade, from a bipolar to a tripolar regime. And that has very different characteristics and new challenges for those who are engaged not only in nuclear strategy, but we also see strategic warfare not only becoming multipolar in terms of the tripolar nuclear regime, but also multidimensional with the emergence of non-nuclear strategic strike capabilities and cyber capabilities. So this is quite a task, if you will, for today's American military to basically address these three major shifts within a relatively short period of time, and to come out with hopefully a better position, a better sense of competitive advantage relative to our rivals. Next slide, please. Just briefly, what we've seen over the last 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution is that these periods of disruptive change in the character of warfare, these military revolutions, are occurring with greater frequency. And as you can see by the chart there, it lists the taxonomy that I've developed that describes these revolutions. And of course, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these disruptive shifts are likely to occur again in the coming decade. And the fact that so many of these technologies that we're talking about are available, widely available, suggests that not only are we capable of exploiting these technologies to effect boosts in military effectiveness, but so are some of our principal rivals. And again, I would put the People's Liberation Army at the head of the line in terms of the competitive position. Next slide, please. One of the things that is certainly going to challenge those entering the profession of arms in the current period is this development or this spread of the military competition into ever greater domains. And if you look again at the chart here, you see that over the past 2 centuries, we've gone from warfare waged arguably in 2 domains to, again, using my taxonomy, 8 domains. And another interesting aspect of this is that if you go back 2 centuries, there wasn't much that land forces could do to directly influence operations at sea, and correspondingly, not much the maritime forces could do to directly influence war on land. What we've seen, if you look at the first bullet there, is advances in speed, range, and accuracy have enabled forces in one domain to influence combat and military operations in other domains. So you have this emergence, particularly toward the end of the 20th century with, again, what the Russians called reconnaissance strike complex operations. This ability to basically pull from 8 different domains to influence what was going on in a particular domain. So if you think about how you might blockade Taiwan, just to pick out something as an example, 2 centuries ago, you would have ships. Now you can draw on land-based systems, electromagnetic warfare, undersea forces, seabed forces, cyber forces, all to support a blockade of Taiwan. So in a sense, you might say that we're going from 2-dimensional to 8-dimensional chess, however that would be played, with many potential combinations to boost military effectiveness. So if we're talking again about that blockade operation, what is the optimum mix of forces drawn from these 8 domains to create a blockade of maximum effectiveness? And of course, you can apply this sort of exercise to other missions as well. So there's this enormous level of uncertainty about what is the optimum blend of forces, if you will. And how do we reduce that uncertainty? And how do we identify best practices to exploit these technologies in order to realize this boost in effectiveness? And in the book that Admiral Spicer mentioned, I looked at 4 cases of militaries that led the way in disruptive innovation to realize what many historians call military revolutions. And it was the Royal Navy around the turn of the 20th century, the so-called Dreadnought or Fisher Revolution, the German military's development of blitzkrieg in the 1920s and 30s, the American Navy's shift from a battleship-oriented Navy to a Navy in World War II, built very much around the fast carrier task forces, and the American Air Force's shift from the Vietnam War to the first Gulf War, from more of a traditional, if you will, practice of air power operations to, again, what the Russians began to call reconnaissance strike complex operations. Next slide, please. So not only do you have this head scratching problem for our graduating midshipmen and those that are going to follow, but what means will they have to basically attempt to exploit these disruptive changes or respond to them? And one measure, and it's only one, to give you an example, is the scale problem, the scale at which our adversaries can compete with us. In this case, using gross domestic product and basically the size of the economy of our rivals over the past century to our economy. And as you see in World War I, Germans about a third of our economy. World War II, Germany and Japan about 40%, Soviet Russia about 40%. Today, communist China, roughly 2/3 of our economy. If you look at different measures such as purchasing power parity, their economy actually exceeds ours. And of course, if you combine the Russians with the Chinese, it's about 3/4 the size of our economy. So the scale at which our rivals can compete is significantly greater, at least in terms of this metric, compared to what we've experienced over the last century or so. Next slide, please. So not only is the potential threat growing in terms of what our rivals might be able to do in terms of generating military power, but it's likely that the resources we have in a relative sense for defense are going to decline. And this is drawn from the Congressional Budget Office projections that come out annually and look out 10 years. And so if you look at our average defense spending from during the Cold War period, it was about 7.5% of GDP. Now we're at about 3%. We're going down to 2.4% of GDP, again, based on CBO projections. So in a world, as they say in the movie trailers, where our rivals are nearly doubled in terms of their relative GDP to ours, our percentage of GDP devoted to defense is about 1/3. So when you're thinking about disruptive military innovation, and you're thinking about how do we do it and what resources are we going to have to affect it, we may be very limited in terms of what areas we can compete in. And so establishing basically strategic priorities is going to be extremely important to us. You can read the bad news in the chart there and the even more worrisome news in the two bullets beneath. But one thing that struck me in doing the research was that in World War II, if you will, the so-called mechanization, aviation, radio, radar revolution, the Germans basically focused on mechanized air-land warfare. The Japanese, for example, on matching, in a sense, our ability to wage war at sea through the use of fast carrier task forces. We not only did what the Germans did, we not only did what the Japanese did, we developed modern amphibious assault operations and strategic aerial bombardment operations. So we competed across the board because we had the resources to do so. Again, I suspect that for us, we're going to have to become more of a niche investor as opposed to a broad-based investor when it comes to thinking about how to exploit these emerging technologies to affect a military revolution, a disruptive shift in the character of war. Next slide, please. I think that's it for the slides. What I'd like to do at this point is to turn things over to our moderator, Midshipman Aaron Goff, who I think is going to lead us through the rest of the presentation. So, Midshipman.
Thanks, Dr. Krepinovich. It's Ray again. I'll introduce our midshipman here. But I would ask that you start thinking about questions for Dr. Krepinovich as the Midshipman Goff moderates this session. So I would like to introduce Midshipman First Class Aaron Goff. He's a member of the Naval Academy class of 2026, currently pursuing a degree in robotics and control engineering, and he aims to commission as a pilot unless I can convince him to go SWO. Midshipman Goff is going to lead Q&A with Dr. Krepinovich and then open it up to our in-person and virtual audience for questions. So Midshipman Goff, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. We're going to start with some pre-prepared questions. If any of you all have any questions that you want to pose later, I ask that you please make your way down to the microphones. We're going to turn over for those questions at around 9:25. All right, Dr. Krepinovich, the first question is, in your book, The Origins of Victory, you note that U.S. leaders are out of practice when it comes to facing near-peer adversaries. After decades focused on counterterrorism, what steps do you think our leaders need to take to adapt to today's era of great power competition?
Well, I think first we need to get our strategic fundamentals right. Again, as I mentioned in the course of the overview there, I do not think, have the resources to address every threat at an acceptable level of risk. And looking at the ongoing debate between, is it China, is it Russia, in terms of our two great power rivals, I came up with 4 metrics. And one is which country has the greatest ability over the next 10 years or so to generate combat potential, and it's China. In what theater do we lack strategic depth? I think, again, it's along the first island chain as opposed to Europe, where there's much greater strategic depth. Third is where do we have a frontline state that is a great power? We don't have that in Europe. In Asia, we have Japan, we have South Korea, we have Taiwan. And then fourth, if we were not present, if there was a world without the United States, could our Asian allies or our European allies do a better job of defending themselves? And in Europe, you have a country like Italy, whose GDP is greater than Russia's. And so in the case of Europe, the Europeans, and again, I'm not saying we abandon Europe, but I'm just saying, well, we have to place priorities. Again, I think the relative balance, if you don't have the United States and Asia, creates greater advantages and opportunities for China. So if that's the case, then we have to think about what is our mission in Asia. And it seems to me, given our alliances, our mission or our operational challenge would be to defend the first island chain. And then the question becomes, if that is the operational challenge, then how do we go about doing it? What is our operational concept? And over the last 15 years or so, we've been through one concept after another, from air-sea battle to joint warfighting concept to multi-domain operations. And I think we need to settle on what exactly is the operational concept we're going to pursue, because that will inform defense priorities in terms of capabilities, how we exploit these technologies. Be glad if somebody wants to ask the question to give you the example of how we did this in the Cold War. But the importance of developing an operational concept and testing it is something I can't overemphasize. And then finally, when do we need to be, how do we balance near-term and long-term readiness? Because if we do think there's going to be this disruptive shift in warfare over the next decade, or perhaps multiple shifts, then history tells us that some capabilities that are highly valued now are going to depreciate rather rapidly in terms of value over the next decade. I'll give you sort of the classic example. We were investing heavily in battleships in the late 1930s. After Midway, we basically truncate the Iowa class and we canceled the Montana class. And so how do we apportion near-term and long-term readiness? So I think those are some of the basic questions that need to be addressed before we start to decide what areas of the competition we're going to be in, and how do we leverage technology in order to develop military effectiveness at a much higher level than we have to date.
Thank you, sir. The second question is that do you think today's U.S. military culture is ready to adapt to the new wave of technological change? And if not, what are your main concerns about our state of evolving leadership doctrine?
I would say that if you look at the sort of the lessons learned that come out of the 4 case studies, and let me parenthetically say that 4 case studies is not a huge data set. But in my estimation, if you have these commonalities, at least in these 4 instances, it gives you something to build on. One area of concern to me is a lack of tenure in some of our senior officers. In fact, many. If you look at the 4 cases that I examined in the book, you find that the British First Sea Lord, Admiral Fisher, was either deputy or First Sea Lord for 8 years and then is recalled to active duty 4 years later. In the interim, he is an advisor to the Sea Lord, Winston Churchill. So you have this, if you're going to give somebody a task like transform the military or engage in disruptive innovation, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. And historically speaking, it's required an individual with extended tenure and also the ability to basically institutionalize what they're trying to do. So if you look at our Navy and the development of carrier aviation, you have Admiral Moffett, who is the first head of the Bureau of Aeronautics when it's established in 1921. He holds that office for 12 years, dies actually in an airship crash in 1933. Another example, of course, would be Admiral Rickover. And so it's the same with General Creech in the Air Force, General von Secht in the German military. It's also the same in the private sector and industry, where you have, of course, that form of competition. So I would say one thing is that we need to really think about is extended tenure among our leaders. And I guess a second point I would make is the use of experimentation. If you look at each of the 4 cases, they realize that there's an enormous amount of uncertainty. And how do they figure out what's going to work and what isn't? And how do they keep pace with just how fast the technology is advancing? And the ultimate test of that in each case is exercises at the operational level of war. So what you see with the Royal Navy, their big problem, or one of their big problems, is their whole way of fighting is built around blockading an enemy fleet in its base. Well, the introduction of torpedoes and then submarines and then mines makes this unfeasible, and they keep trying to conduct these fleet exercises to see, well, what do we do? How do we adapt? Because we have new technologies too. And again, be glad to go into greater depth with that if somebody has a question on it. The same thing with respect to our Navy. In Fleet Problem 9, which is how the Navy described its large-scale exercises, the carrier Saratoga was given permission to bomb the Panama Canal, which shocked the hell out of just about everybody involved, and led Admiral Pratt to basically advance and promote greater thinking and exercise variations on how we might use carriers. And in February 1932, it was a Sunday, the 7th day of the month, we actually had, in one of the fleet problems, 2 U.S. carriers bomb Pearl Harbor 9 years before the Japanese did it. And so you start to, through these exercises, which is the closest you can get to war, it gives you, again, as good a sense as you're going to get as to what's working, what isn't, what the state of technology is, and so on. What we don't have today in our military is something like this, something where we can wage cross-domain warfare with all the services involved at the operational level of war against a PLA OPFOR. And I've been talking about this for about 25 years now, including with various of our military leaders and also with the Australians who have been quite receptive to the idea of establishing such a large training center in their country. But the resistance to it is once you start to do this, and you can see it in each of the 4 cases, there's enormous resistance, because if what you're saying is the way we wage war today has got to change dramatically, there's going to be winners and losers. And they're going to, some of the dominant tribes of the military services are going to become a lot less dominant. And I can tell you, based on my experience with the Army, that the notion of archipelagic defense along the first island chain gives them the willies, because basically it devalues some of the dominant branches in the Army. And you can certainly see it again and again over time. So I would say 2 things. One is we're going to have to think about senior officer tenure. And second, we're going to have to come up with ways to reduce uncertainty about what works and what isn't going to work. And of course, going back to the first question that you raised, we're going to have to set some strategic fundamentals before we get to these issues.
Our next question is, we are currently seeing a rise in AI warfighting tools, such as the Lavender system currently used to identify targets for Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza. How do you see these new AI tools impacting the modern battle space?
I'm not a technologist, and so thankfully we have those people with great credentials participating in today's conference. What I would say, based upon my limited expertise, is that it seems to me that AI is going to be an important factor in warfare, to state the obvious. We're seeing AI being introduced into drones. We see AI being introduced in terms of managing the enormous flow from our scouting systems, or whether you want to call it RISTA or C4ISR, so that this avalanche of information the chaff can be weeded out through AI, and so the wheat can be digested and analyzed by individuals, by humans. I'll give you an example, personal example of how AI could make a big difference. A few years back, I was having a conversation with Admiral Aquilino, and he was talking about all these technologies and how do we know what's going to work. And we were talking about fleet air defense, and he said, geez, if some of the problems associated with lasers can be addressed, then these could be very effective in terms of intercepting enemy cruise missiles and so on. Rail guns, how much you use those, and so. But then the question comes up: okay, we make advances in directed energy, but what about hypersonics? Hypersonic missile comes in if they can solve the issues with respect to, say, cruise missile hypersonics. It's moving too fast. It's moving too fast. The laser doesn't have enough dwell time. We're screwed. And then there's the issue of, drones. Suppose you have a drone swarm coming at the fleet. You might be able to successfully engage it, but how long is the swarm persisting? And in that case, you have the limits of human endurance. Anybody who's played a video game, there was one of the early ones was called Space Invaders. And initially the invasion was manageable, but then they kept coming faster and faster. And pretty soon you were overwhelmed. And so at that point, you might turn things over to AI because AI doesn't get tired, it doesn't get weary, it doesn't need a coffee break. So we're at the beginning, it seems to me, still at the very beginning of what AI can do. By the way, I've been reading articles that talk about how AI is trying to con the people who are using it, trying to set its own agenda. And there's a recent article about how AI, the algorithms and so on, the data that is used to generate the algorithms can be compromised. And so just how safe, how secure, and then the ultimate question, of course, of AI is anybody who remembers Fantasia and the Sorcerer's Apprentice, you think you're in control of something. And of course, the more autonomy you give AI and the more important the mission, you're hoping that it comes up with some brilliant insights or ways of managing the situation. But it can also come up with some interesting ways of that actually are counterproductive. And so you wouldn't want an AI system that, for example, was helping you with fleet defense, but then started shooting down our own aircraft. Not to give you concerns, Midshipman Goff, given your projected career path. So, and you can say these about other technologies as well. It's so I'll end there.
Thank you, sir. And our final pair of questions is, as our adversaries are working towards developing new military technologies to surpass the U.S.'s capabilities, how can we best respond to technical innovations made by our enemies?
Well, couple of points there. One of the, and this was this really struck me with respect to the Royal Navy, which had a dominant position, of course, in the 19th century, early 20th century, relative to the other navies of the world. And again, their resources were limited, as ours, and it became progressively more limited as ours are becoming. And there's something in the business world called the first or second move advantage. And if you think about this, okay, if you look at the transition from wind and sail and wooden ships to steam-driven ironclads, you see that the British basically had the technology to make the shift. Their argument in the 1840s was, why should we make the shift? We have, in terms of the current coin of the realm, wooden ships and iron men, we dominate. And so why should we basically obsolesce all this capital stock and move to something new and different? And in fact, it was the French, their principal naval rivals, that went first in terms not only of steam, but also in terms of iron plating their ships. And because the Royal Navy had two things that we lack today, okay, a lesson for us. One is they had a formidable industrial base, shipbuilding. And second, they had the capital and the expertise that enabled them to move very fast. So even though the French went first, by the time the first Navy to develop a significant warfighting capability in this new kind of ship were the British. Okay, fast forward to the first decade of the 20th century, and you have Jackie Fisher, who's the first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy. He decides to pursue the first move advantage. Well, why does he do that? It's a period where Germany is becoming the principal naval rival to Britain. They're building an entire new class of battleships. And according to the existing designs, Fisher decides to build a new kind of battleship. It's the first all big gun battleship. And basically the firepower of the ship, according to the wisdom of the time, obsolesced all existing battleships. Didn't quite do that, but it wrecked the German shipbuilding program. So he went first with an idea of imposing disproportionate costs on the Germans. And he only built one dreadnought. There was only one ship in that class because, again, with technology advancing rapidly, he was looking to move on to battle cruisers and then submarines, which he thought were the bee's knees, to use a term popular in those days. So, we have to think about in technology, do you move first or do you move second? Second is if you don't know what technology is going to work, buy options. And so if you look at our Navy in the 20s and 30s, we don't quite know how what form of bombardment at sea using strike aircraft is going to be most effective. And so the Navy develops torpedo bombers. They develop horizontal bombers, you just drop the bomb. And then they develop dive bombers, the heroes of Midway, because they didn't quite know what was going to work. And of course, it's the torpedo bombers that get shot to hell at Midway. But again, it's sort of these, what options can we create because we don't know how things are going to turn out. Same thing with the size of the carriers. So arms control allows us, the Washington Naval Treaty, to convert 2 cruisers to carriers, but it limits the amount of tonnage that we can apply to carriers to 175,000 tons. So for economic reasons, we convert 2 cruisers, Saratoga and Lexington, to carriers in the late 1920s. Well, they're over 30,000 tons, and they're driving Moffett crazy because they're soaking up so much of his available tonnage. So he decides to build the Carrier Ranger, which is about the third the size, about 14,000 tons. And then in the late 1930s, we build the Goldilocks class, the Yorktown, which is in the low 20,000 tons. And those are roughly the class that does so well for us in World War II. But we look at doing all kinds of things. There were actually plans for aircraft to be based on submarines. There was this, anybody in the audience, I'll take you out to lunch. If you know what a flying deck cruiser is, it was a way that Moffett was trying to get around the limit on tonnage by taking a cruiser and making the back end of it sort of a flat top. And it was a terrible idea, as it turned out. But unfortunately, Congress didn't approve it because of the Depression. But they just, what it turned out was you needed a big carrier to have the size of the carrier wing that proved so effective in the war. And also, in the case of the flying deck cruiser, the runway was too short because aircraft technology was moving so rapidly. So again, this point about other countries are innovating, we need to buy some options because we don't know what's going to work and what isn't. I would say one other thing. One is if we're looking at an area where we're competing similar to them, are they coming up with capabilities and ways of fighting operational concepts that are similar to ours but very different? So I'll give you an example. In the Cold War, we and the Russians, in terms of the European front, mechanized air-land operations, for much of that period. And so it was very symmetrical, relatively speaking. And if that's the case, then maybe you don't need to worry so much about how technology is being applied and so on. But go back to World War II, and you look at the Germans and the French in terms of their armies and air forces. The Germans were looking at an operational concept built around combined arms, mechanized air-land operations, and widely dispersed and linked by radio. The French were looking to refight World War I. Somebody was going to be, it was possible that both of them could be very wrong. But it was also possible that one of them could be very wrong and one of them could be very right. And of course, as history shows, it was the Germans that had the right idea. And so if we saw, for example, the Chinese leveraging technology to apply it in very different ways, then I think we have to ask ourselves the questions, well, if they're going in this direction and we're going in the opposite direction or something close to it, then do we think we're right and they're wrong? If we think they're wrong, then we should encourage them to go down the dead-end path. If we think that they're wrong, but it turns out they might be right, then you get to this issue of hedging. Do we buy options so that we can adapt to that form of warfare if it turns out in the heat of battle that they have a better idea? So there's a lot to think about in response to that question.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. And we'll now be opening up our live audience Q&A. If any of you have any questions, please make your way down to the microphones. Also, if you're tuning in live, please type out your questions and we can circle through those. Yes, sir.
Hey, Andy, it's Gregory Glaros, Admiral Sobrowski's old sidekick. How are you?
Hey, good to see you.
Hey, and you touched on probably a key word here, which was resistance to change. And that resistance to change, you highlighted some of those who were heroic in their efforts. Certainly Fisher was one of them. But there was another, Billy Mitchell, who we court-martialed for proposing the grand changes that ultimately came about. Do we have the leadership within, say, one service, the Naval Service, to bring about that change, either in uniform or in the Secretariat staff?
I think the short answer right now is no, not because of any particular individual, but because of the way the system is structured. And just a sidebar on Billy Mitchell. Mitchell was the Dave Deptula of his era. Dave's a friend of mine who just bleeds Air Force blue. Mitchell actually cooked the books on his famous exercise. They had this German battleship, the Ostfriesland, that was basically sieged after the end of World War I. They told the land-based aircraft, where the ship was, and they didn't allow ship to maneuver. It was really, sort of a tethered goat kind of situation. That's not to say, of course, that naval aviation didn't eventually kill battleships, but at that time it was kind of a fraud. And then Mitchell, more for just basically going off the reservation so many times, ended up being court-martialed, I think, not because he had bad ideas about where aviation might go, but because he just wouldn't obey orders. But if you want to see the good side of Billy Mitchell, watch the Gary Cooper movie where Gary Cooper plays Billy Mitchell. In terms of, and this is not just with respect to the Navy, I think it's all four services, and I'll go back to this, you can't give an admiral. So Mattis and I had this conversation about, I don't know, 20 years ago when he was commanding Joint Forces Command, and he asked me to come down and look at the command and so on. And I said to him, if we do this right, and you have a 3-year tour here at Joint Forces Command, and that was the command that was supposed to transform, be the engine of transformation, basically identify technologies, fit them into an operational concept, test the concept, and so on. And so Mattis is in charge of that. And I said, if we're going to do this right, and you look at Fisher and Moffett and Rickover and von Zecht and Creech, if you do a good job in 3 years, we need to give you another 3-year tour here. So it's almost like Bureau of Naval Reactors. But then if you do good after 6 years, then we need to fleet you up to be the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs for 4 years, because at the time that individual had a lot of responsibility for requirements and the budget and so on. And so a 10-year runway. And along the way, if you can do what Fisher did, as long as we're talking about Fisher, his acolytes, he established acolytes, he looked to promote them. Creech did the same thing. Moffett did the same thing. The guy who succeeded Moffett at Bureau Air was King. And you can go on down the line. These guys, they not only do they have extended tenure, but they see the senior officer corps with their apostles. And so it's very difficult, I think, in absent that kind of environment and that's kind of situation, to give that senior guy or gal the time they need to, and I'll just say the Syndicate of Discontent, which was the group that formed an opposition. The contemporary syndicates of discontent, I think, are just as formidable as they were for any of the other cases that I looked at in terms of the external opposition, whether it's the defense industry or the dominant tribes or other services looking to poach on your missions and so on. It's very well. Let me just sum up by saying it's not the people. It's, I think, more the system to some extent. So.
Good morning, Dr. Pepinovich. My name is Dr. Paul Lara. I come from one of the warfare centers, and I'd really like your thought of the wicked problem and the expansion from land and sea over to the other domains. And from the work that I do, like that expansion comes with systems that are increasingly complex, that have a lot more risk associated with their development. So what are your thoughts on, and to add to that, or technological development is risk adverse, I would say. So to add to that, can you speak a little bit as to how, over the technology development on your book, how leaders have tackled this reduction of risk adversity in their technology insertion and domain?
Okay. I would there's this very interesting article or short story written by Arthur C. Clarke, who is the author of 2001 and the Space Odyssey, that made it the movie and so on. It was called Superiority, and it was published in the early 1950s, and it talked about a future where these scientists had developed what they thought was just this incredibly effective spaceship, battle spaceship, but it was incredibly complex, and they had been kicking their adversaries' butts for generations. And they feel, well, now we're really going to kick their butts. And so they invested in this, and they keep having glitches. And the glitches keep them from winning, and eventually they lose. The space war, if you will. And so I do, well, let me tell you a little bit of a war story. Maybe that'll help. I am concerned about that. Back in the early 2000s, the Army had a program called the Future Combat System. And it comprised about 14 or 15 different systems between combat vehicles and drones and so on, fire systems. And the folks at Boeing came to see me. They were going to be the systems integrator for this. And I said, well, how many technologies are involved in this? Oh, 34. And I said, well, are they all mature? No, they're various states of maturing. And I said, well, if technology number 17 doesn't mature, is the Future Combat System 80% effective, 60% effective? And you get into all these questions, and you're right, to the extent that you layer more and more technologies on having to mature or having to achieve a certain level of proficiency to make this work, you're taking on risk. And again, my point, I'll beat the drum on it again, is at some point, obviously we test these systems, but to find out how truly effective they are, we need to establish a center where we can conduct high fidelity training against a realistic Chinese OP4 to find out not only does it work, but does it boost our effectiveness? Is it something that the commander keeps taking out of the toolbox as opposed to letting it sit there? So I think it's a combination of those two things, making sure, since we're trying to integrate to such a high level, that the integration is actually working and the system's performing. But the other risk you have to that is what I would call the case of the slows, as President Lincoln once said about General McClellan. We move way too slowly. I mean, the whole drone experience, one of the key takeaways for me is we build these incredibly expensive drones that take forever to build. And we've got countries that are building good enough drones very fast, very cheap, in very great numbers. And if you think about, as I do, a war with China and looking at the state of our industrial base, okay, if the war goes long, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to build a lot of F-35s for midshipman Goff. You know, if we need a lot of something, it's probably going to be a lot of drones, not because drones are typically, so fantastically effective, but because they're cheap and we can build a lot of them in a hurry. So again, that's also intra-war, near-term, long-term readiness issue. There's a lot of complex problems here, and you highlighted one of them. One thing I would say, I wanted to make sure I said this, is those who are entering the profession of arms today, I think, face a greater array of challenges at a more intense level than any members of the profession going back at least a century. So to my friend Aaron Goff here, and to the Naval Academy, I admire your willingness to take on the challenge, and knowing the history of the Naval Academy and the people who come from the Naval Academy, I'm confident that these young men and women will meet the challenge. And I wanted to make sure I acknowledged just how remarkable this institution is and the people who come and graduate from it. So, next question.
Dr. Tim Oliver, with a career in submarines, I'm interested in your thoughts on how we as a country, with our current administration having its own debate internally about isolationism with respect to AUKUS, if we can't come to a conclusion on how we're going to work with our allies, how do you see us being able to move forward on some of these challenges against the Chinese?
I think the success of AUKUS is critical to our ability to maintain not only good alliance relationships with the Australians, who constantly point out to me that they've been with us in every war going back to World War I, and they're the only country that has been, and I trust them on that. And second, in terms of the ability to maintain a military balance that's sufficient to deter, defeat the Chinese if it comes to it. So going back to the mid-2010s, the Australians had approached me about the idea, which became AUKUS. And at the time, the head of naval reactors was John Richardson. And I went to see John and asked him what he thought. And he gave me this incredibly long list of concerns that our Navy has about the safety of nuclear submarines and the need to avoid accidents, and the general mistrust we have about others who haven't been fully validated. And so I think in one aspect, that concern probably is an undercurrent in the Navy, and I would say rightly so, through this whole process. And my understanding is that the process is one that attempts to take this into account. The other issue is our shipbuilding capability. And I've talked to folks at General Dynamics Electric Boat, and it is not just a money issue, as it is with our shipbuilding capacity overall. It is a capacity issue. It's also a labor force issue, where you have block retirements, where you have young people who I always hear about the welders. So the welders must be really important. But these people have these special skills. And I talked to one guy, and he said, their fathers or their uncles may have loved overtime and working overtime. These people, they just, I work my 40 hours a week. I just want to chill. I don't care if you pay me double time, double the rate or whatever. And so it's an industrial capacity, it's an industrial labor force issue. And I don't know how we solve that very quickly when the Navy is demanding, Virginia class subs, but we also have promised it to the Australians. I don't see an easy way out of it. But it is something that concerns me because I think we absolutely need the Australians, and they probably almost certainly need to get into that business because the boats they have now, they're diesels, they're old, and if you're going to move forward, they need to move forward with attack submarines with the range that they have and the capabilities.
Thank you, Doctor.
Our last question will be fielded by Midshipman.
Sir, Midshipman Second Class Durkin. I'm a robotics major here at the Naval Academy. You talked a bit about how investments go out of date quickly and that rate is increasing. It's getting quicker every day. My question was, to what degree, if any, do you think the Department of War contracting system has to be reformed in order to accommodate this new technology and keep the U.S. on the cutting edge?
I think it desperately needs to be reformed. That's a great question. As I said, the way we do business in terms of acquisition reminds me of what President Lincoln said about General McClellan after Antietam. The man has a case of the slows. If he doesn't want to use the Army, I'd like to borrow it for a while. When I served on Secretary Gates's policy board, one of his constant themes was, I'd rather have an 80% solution to a system that I can actually field and use than a 100% solution that the military says they're going to keep giving me, but I never see get to the field. And when you look at the frigate program that we have, when you look at the number of systems that have just been canceled, the Army's Future Combat System, the Army's Crusader Artillery System, the Army's new, this is back in the 2010s, fighting vehicle. I mean, it's just one after another, and they take so long. And I'll say one other thing because it's a burr under my saddle. There's also institutional resistance when you're talking about moving into new ways of war, new kinds of capabilities that basically lead to the rise of a new tribe within the service that threatens an existing dominant tribe, just as the naval aviators threatened the battleship gun club, as they call themselves. And it's one thing it's something that really brought it home to me. Around 2010, the Navy contracted and got 2 prototypes. I think they were called the X-47Bs. They were drone aircraft. They were stealthy. They could carry a weapons payload. They tested them. They could land on a carrier. They could take off from a carrier. And around 2017, 2018, when I was chairing the CONO executive panel, there was this issue we had at one of the meetings about, why wasn't the Navy moving forward on this? And the N9, as I just wasn't keen on it. And what we got was the MQ-25. We need something different. But the MQ-25 was not going to be able to carry a weapons payload. But that's what the Navy was going to do. And we're going to move fast on this, or we're going to get it on the deck of a carrier. Well, this is, 2017, 2018. Here we are, 2025. The latest I read was there's another delay in the MQ-25 program. The only thing I can think of is what this aviator, apologies to Midshipman Goff, who once said to me, this is a pilot, he said, drones? He said, no guy is ever going to pick up a girl by telling him that he commands a drone wing. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into the resistance here, but again, it is the system. It is institutional resistance in terms of the dominant tribes. It's a really rich menu that you have to wade through to try and make these corrections. And as you noted in your question, people are running circles around us, and just to use the drone as an example, in terms of producing drones fast, drones cheap. And, if you can lose 5 or 10 and it really doesn't make any difference, you don't want to build sort of the ultimate drone that, never really gets there or is too expensive to produce in large numbers. So, again, great question. And God bless you if you're going to be involved in the acquisition community to try and fix it. My prayers and thoughts are with you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your time today, sir. I'll turn it back over to Admiral Spicer. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Krepinovich, I want to thank you so much for your thoughtful comments and for taking some questions from the audience here. And Midshipman Goff, great job as moderator. You're hired. You can come back anytime. So a nice round of applause. And for both of you, we have a small token of our appreciation, Naval Power in Action by Brent Sadler, which will pop in the mail to you, sir, and we can give you today, Aaron. The other thing I would say, we're going to take a break now. We're going to be back in here right at 10 o'clock for our first panel of the day. We hope to have some midshipmen showing up throughout the day. So if you see a midshipman who's up in line to ask a question, please let him take cuts in front of you so we can get the mids right up there front and center. So with that, we'll see you back here right at 10 o'clock. Thank you so much.